Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Adoption Dialog, the program about all things adoption, the joys, the challenges, and the many complexities. My name is Judith Alexis Craig, and I'm one of your co-hosts of Adoption Dialog. I was a foundling adoptee born in Haiti and adopted to a predominantly white family in Canada. I'm now a parent myself of both biological and non-biological children. I'm a therapist and social worker and have worked in the adoption and permanency field for about 20 years.
And my name is Sally Baff. I'm a co-host as well. I'm based in London. Judith is based in Canada. I was an interior architect, and after adopting twins, I decided to be a stay-at-home mom. Got a part-time job to be able to look after them, to meet their complex needs, and soon became an adoption consultant. And that's what I do. And so this program really is about learning and sharing, learning mainly from people who've been adopted and other experiences so that we can share the experiences with all of you. So thank you for joining us for Adoption Dialogue. And today we have Mr. Adis Soya. Adis Soya is an activist in the Ghanaian community here in Britain. He's also a management consultant and has been around for very, very many years. He's also a traditionalist and has a lot of tremendous knowledge about the Ga culture in particular. The Ga is a clan that is based in the capital of Ghana, which is Accra. And Ade is an activist and an expert in their field. So today Ade is going to talk to us about kinship care. And by kinship care, we're talking about children who are being looked after within their family. There's a traditional mode of adoption that existed in Ghana, which has existed forever in Ghana. And whilst it doesn't have any papers attached to it, as in legalized in court, it was very, very much a legitimate way of looking after children who could not be looked after by their own birth family. So today, Ade is going to share with us everything that he knows about it. Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Ade, thank you so much for being with us today. Can you explain a little bit about what is kinship adoption, just so people have sort of that initial understanding?
Well, from a custom perspective, the Ghana tradition is that we actually live in family houses with an extended family. So you have a house where there are several siblings and they tend to have their children, and the children also live with them in the house. So there's sort of a communal way in which people live. Okay. So I grew up in a house where my parents, my mother, there were about maybe 6 other siblings in the same house who also had their children who were also in the same house. So we grew up not just as brothers and sisters with my siblings, but all my cousins were also my sisters and my brothers. Were looked after the different parents and were cared for by the different parents. So for the first 10 years of my life, I lived within that setting. And so once you enter that setting, actually cared for by everybody within that extended family grouping. So if you go to Old Accra, you see that the homes are very large homes. They are mansions, several bedrooms, we also have several children. So if you go to a particular compound, you probably see brothers who are really cousins, and you may probably see second cousins also living in the same house, really having that kinship with their peer group and their contemporary. So within that setting, it means that it is just children just are nurtured by the different members of the family who live together.
Will these primarily be mothers or both fathers and mothers in this household? I think that's
they're actually both mothers and fathers. But what generally happens is that, again, in most Ghana homes, there's the male side and there's the female side. And so there's one section of the house which has the males who live there to adulthood, and then you have the females who also live within the same household, but in a different side. And you see that is the female side where all the cooking and things go on, yeah. And the male side, well, they are kind of independent people, and they are actually looked after by their female siblings, as well as if some of them have their wives within their household. So it's a question of people living that kind of life, and their children also then grow up. And the traditional thing is that maybe after a certain length of time, when they are able to build their own homes, they then moved out. They then move out of the homes with their wives to actually start maybe a family house, or more modern times, people now live in nuclear family system. My view is that we've come from a situation where there's a lot of customary adoption, customary kinship children, to a situation which is now people living in nuclear families. And therefore, we now have the importance of people using the legal framework to make adoption more formal than customary is today still accepted. There are many reasons why that customary system still thrives, despite the fact that there's now probably a formal legal way of adoption.
The thing is, I suppose, with the way you described it, what you're picturing right now is exactly what the Ghanaian saying about it takes a village to raise a child. And that is exactly how that village is formed in the Ghanaian traditional system, literally. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, how does it work? If you have so many different people living in the household, friction, harmony, what's that like? I mean, how do they manage the challenges of human relationships with each other and that kind of friction that could arise in that situation? Also, in the same way, because even if it's among the adults, it'll spill over into the children. How are those situations managed?
It's always difficult to manage personal relations. Even when people live in nuclear family, there's still tension in the house. But it depends on the fact that the people who live in the house know that maybe they are living there on a temporary basis. Either if they get married, they live, or their husbands come to take them away, or whatever. So although the tensions are there, it's kind of minimized, because if you have nowhere else to go, then it means that you would have to. And besides, these are people who probably lived their lives as siblings, children. And they may have been competitive, but when they grow old, they actually then start probably becoming a lot more sensible in terms of if that dispute. They know how to maybe mediate or manage disputes that come up. So it is not easy to live in a family house, but it works, okay? And underlying that, when you get into the issue of adoption, underlying that there's also a saying that every child has a parent, and it is the person who nurtures you that is your real parent. So you can immediately see within that system that there may be children whose maybe biological fathers maybe do not take charge of them. But it doesn't mean that they really miss anything, because they're still living in their house with other people, older people, female as well as male, who give them that guidance, give them that sense of nurturing.
One of the sort of discussion points that comes up is, will the child be able to form strong, secure attachment? Because there's so many adults, right? One may be concerned that, is this child going to have a couple of those aunties and uncles who they can feel very secure and go to consistent, or is it sort of more open? Because attachment is something that's, of course, very important for children.
It depends on the context that you're talking about. My father never hugged me. There was no reason for it. Indeed, I would cringe if he tried to hug me. That was the way I was conditioned.
Right.
So you can't introduce Western concept of what love and attachment, my particular setting in which I was to move around with my peer group rather than my parents. My parents were probably there mainly for support issues. So I'll tell you how I grew up. Jamestown, boisterous, people look out for each other. But when you get out of the house and you are playing, it's kind of a lot of theft wars and things like that. I'm not talking about violence as such, but I'm saying that you need to be able to create a tough mind so that you're able to negotiate. So when you come home, really, you know who your parents are. But because you are not in a new family system, okay, so the difference is that in all my years in England, I spent a lot of time in the house. In Ghana, I actually went into the house to sleep because there's outside sitting in the compound doing other things. So a room is really somewhere that you sleep. And I'm talking about my growing up. That's the kind of conditioning that there's always a yard and there are people doing all sorts of things in the yard. Ladies, parents or mothers cook in the yard We didn't have a kitchen stove, that kind of thing. And I'm talking about a period probably in the 40s and the 50s. I grew up in the 50s, so very much a child of the yard rather than a child of the room or the child of the house. So there's that kind of difference. So attachment is different. I have cousins who I'm closer to than my siblings.
Right. Okay.
Because that's how we grew up.
So are you saying then by the same token, you'd also have aunties, for instance, that you're closer to than maybe your mother or your father?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, it's straight. I'll give you an example. When I decided that I was going to get married, the person I went to was my aunt, not my mother. She's the one who talked to me and provided me with whatever advice and everything. And then when my mother then went to visit them, she must have said that, hey, you know what your son came to talk to me about? Yeah, because it's that kind of system that we live, that we grow up with. I also had uncles that when I had issues with my father, I went to them. So I'm saying that communal system very much prays, and sometimes it operates in a fairly seamless way. Okay, one of the first things my father, for instance, did when we went to secondary school and we came home, have you gone to say hello to your uncles and your aunties? And we all trudge along, hello, uncle, hello. These are people who live outside the house. So I can only really give you that sense of how I live my life in probably what I'll call secure nurturing that I got from my uncles and aunties, and also from my peer group, siblings and cousins.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, because I think it's really important for people to understand the different ways, like you said, that attachment occurs. We don't want to just look at it through one lens. So that makes a lot of sense, that there were still secure, very much so secure attachments being formed, just formed with other adults. And as you said, your peer group as well. So thank you for sharing that. So important.
And I want to really say something here that as Adi was talking, it reminded me of when I went home with my children. You know, they were adopted here formally. And we landed in Ghana, where my aunt was staying with her children and her grandchildren. Very similar to them, because a big house, very much similar to what you're talking about. So once my children were in Ghana with all the other cousins who were around their peer groups, we hardly saw them because the house is a big house. It's got a huge compound around it. The kids are out there playing all the time. They forget they have parents. If they get hurt, the first adult that they see is the one they go to, and the adults will deal with them, you know, and then off they go again. So they don't actually go looking for their mother necessarily because they feel so cared for by everybody around them. I noticed that they were just going to whoever was there. When they did go to school in there, they said, "Mommy, we don't miss you." And I thought, really? Because my sister was there and they were used to her. And she was offering the same amount of nurturing and everything, which was so fascinating. Now that Ade is explaining it in the traditional sense, I'm beginning to relate the two and see how it works. And what I also want to add to it is the fact that that system in itself has its own therapy.
Right.
Because when you are in a community like this and everybody is around you, actually justice reigns in those situations in order that there can be harmony. So you find that people make the effort to do things the right way, correct children who are wrong, and that keeps happening all the time. All the children get proper nurturing, they're corrected as it, and everybody within the household has a duty to look after and correct and direct all those children. So they learn from each other what is right and what is wrong, and they go together doing the right thing. And you'll find that there are certain households, like the one that Adi comes from, for instance, where most of the children who grew out of that household became dynamic human beings and they excelled in life in an extraordinary way. When she mentions who his cousins are, I mean, like one of the highest ranking female who worked in the highest position in the UN, for instance, is his cousin, and he grew up in the same household as Ade did. So you find that there's a lot of nurturing, there's a very positive nurturing and encouragement of the children. And I think also because there isn't an attachment to one person, if somebody is being unfair to you, you know within that household, there's somebody else you can go to who cares about you, who makes time for you. So it balances itself out. You find that those people don't. So mental health, Ade, did you ever have mental health situation among children in those days?
Not really. Maybe there may have been some children who were probably reserved, but I'm using that word reserved in the sense that maybe they were sort of, yeah, a little bit maybe isolated. But people always found a way of bringing them into the fold because you are part of the household. It's kind of difficult to explain when you compare it how we have brought up our children in this country. Because in my youth, when I go out of the house, I mean, my father knows that I won't go to any place which is unsafe, and knows that wherever it is that I go to, in my friend's house, if I go and do something wrong, I'll be corrected in that house because there's that response. Now comes back to what it was that Sally was talking about, that it takes a village to sort of raise a child. It's not just one person responsible. And as I'm speaking, I'm trying to link it to this issue of maybe adoption in the sense, and I start from my perspective of the different types of adoption I can think of in terms of the kinship. Like maybe you have orphan children living within a household, and the process that takes place so that those orphan children are maybe immediately integrated within the family in such a way that probably they don't feel the loss of their parents, or they have somebody who stands in as their parent.
Can you please explain to us how that is achieved? I think that's important to know. How do you achieve that? If a person lost their parents, they've lost their parents.
Well, if you lose your parents at whatever age, whether you are an infant or whether you are as old as I am, and your parent dies, after the burial, there's a process that you are then assigned to somebody within the family. So you are giving a new father or you are giving a new mother. Now, if you are young, it means that the father or that mother would actually take care of you and feed you and nurture you. If you are as old as I am, then it's probably symbolic that you have somebody who you could go to with an issue, okay? But at that young age, the important process is that that person would agree in the presence of witnesses that, yes, my sister Diana is passed on and my sister's children are now being given to me for me to look after them. And so what I do is I then accept in the presence of everybody, like everything that we do in Ghana or within the Ghana custom, you actually open a drink or you present a drink which symbolize that I accept. That's very important. That agreement and that fact that there are witnesses around is the same way that we conduct our marriage, our customary marriage. So a customary marriage, somebody opens with drinks and there are witnesses around, and that sort of legitimizes, makes that cultural process. So any child who loses their parent is giving a new parent.
What you're saying is that whilst here in England, we would go to court, the court would get involved in it. You'd have court papers. The court would agree that you're going to become the new, the signature, paper, certificate, and all of that. You're saying that with us, where the court was never part of that system, the family had its own way of legalizing that kind of family arrangement, so that with the witnesses around, you agreeing with it, the drink which seals that agreement legitimizes it and is equivalent to the court agreement here in the West that we have here over there. And because we have the witnesses, you do not step out of line. You have to adhere to what the promise that you've made. Is that what you're saying to us, Adi?
But it's done in the same way as marriage. You can get married here in church, and if you get married to a Ghanaian, when you go home, the parents will tell you that we don't know what you've done. Come and do the formal marriage, which is where families come together and families agree. And that kind of marriage, when it's done in Ghana, you can actually go and swear an affidavit, and it is accepted in this country as our own traditional form of marriage.
Okay.
So everything you do, like Sally's used the proper will, is sealed with a drink of acceptance that I have taken on this responsibility. So this is my drink. So marriages are contracted, which has nothing to do with going to a registry or something. But those customary marriages are allowed anywhere in the world because that is our form of marriage. And in like fashion, I think that when people taking on the responsibility, adopting other children for whatever reason, there is that issue of witnesses being around, mainly family witness and ceilings with a drink.
So, Ade, thank you very much for that. I think one of the other issues that comes up immediately with this kind of situation is that you've got a child in that household. This is the most legal system that we have because it doesn't involve the courts. But now you have people who are being persuaded, in fact, they are being persuaded with great difficulty to come forward and adopt, and they are resisting it. And the question is, if you're describing what you're saying, which is what means that it was the norm, it was a practice, it was just such an acceptable practice that you didn't even think about it. What do you think is causing this resistance at this moment? What is it you think, in, especially Black people, because we have a lot of resistance when it comes to adoption from our community here. And if from what you're saying, this is part of our existence, what is it then that's the blockage? Why are we resisting it when it comes to formalizing it here in the West?
I think what it is that there's a daunting process within the West, and there are issues about maybe what I would call the different responsibilities. And those responsibilities are mainly because in this country, the authorities actually have a response towards children. It means that they have to do everything in accordance with the law. And I think it's probably a lot of people not understand the process of fostering and adoption. That is what makes people hold back. Okay. What I'm beginning to learn is that even in the child protection system here, it is being recommended that when there's an issue within a family, the authority would actually prefer a family member to step forward if there are any family members who can step forward, rather than to give somebody who is not a family member. But I think that people actually do not always understand the fact that in this country, government or the authority have a responsibility towards children. So you as a parent cannot do what you want to do to your parents, get away with if it's an issue of maybe abusing the children, physical, emotional, or whatever, that there is a process of intervening. Whereas back home, within this our cultural system, everybody probably knows that you have a child who you will care for that child. And sometimes the systems that are used or the methods that are used in terms of caring for the children do not accord to maybe modern ways of looking after the children.
Then I think also it helps me to understand the fact that the authority for the family was actually the family system, which people respected. Here in England, the authority has actually changed the local authority. Yeah. And it has a totally different dynamic, because when it's within your family and you know the people, it's easier to make agreements, it's easier to negotiate, it's easier to have an understanding because you're all grown up together, you have shared values. But then when it's transposed to a system like this, where it's almost contrived, because now you're having to ascribe to value systems that are not the norm for you, could that be also the reason why you think people resist? Because they are now talking about value systems that are different from what they were used to.
I think so. The little bit I know about what I call social workers and their intervention is that they look at maybe the way that we brought up our children or we were brought up. They look at it really not as positive within the context of modern advanced European country. So you can't smack your child. I mean, I don't think that you can tell any parent in Ghana that they can't smack their child. Yeah. You can't do that in this country. There are things you can't do. You can't neglect your child in this country. You can't leave them home alone. In Ghana, all you have to do is tell your aunties that, look, I'm going out, and the children are able to fend for themselves so long as they stay within the county. So what I'm saying is that there are probably more modern ways of bringing up children, and that is because in setting we live in nuclear family system rather than the communal system. Okay, so what I'm trying to explain is that people then think in this country that if they have to do something, they have to deal with the authorities. And I do not think probably the social workers and the authorities around, sometimes they do not realize that we come from a different system of parents which has been accepted amongst us, but which really is seen as archaic in this country. So we use an example of corporal punishment. Maybe 50 years ago, it was okay in this country. It no longer is. Yeah. So if somebody comes from Africa, Nigeria, somewhere, and they are still smacking their children or still disciplining their children in that way, they would fall foul of the law. And rightly so, because there are now new positive ways of looking after children. So if somebody within the African community or the Black community wants to take over a responsibility of nurturing, one, the person has to be willing, and two, the person also have to accept that, look, what I'm going to do has different boundaries, has other people making sure that I do it the right way, and then also making sure that there are legal issues that I need to understand.
It sounds very much like there's that education and knowledge sharing that needs to happen in the community. Really, as soon as somebody moves, say to the UK where you both are, or to Canada or the US, right, where things are done differently, there needs to be that understanding and that information shared. Because that, you're right, there are often cases when local authority, or in our country it's Children's Aid Society, or in the States Child Protective Services, will go in and be involved with the family, whether working with them or remove a child because of differences in parenting. And corporal punishment is a very good example of a situation. So I think having that opportunity for folks to become knowledgeable on what in those specific countries are the boundaries is key before they even arrive, right? And helping them to learn about other strategies and tools that we use for disciplining and correcting children's behavior, redirecting them. That's really, really essential.
I think it is essential. And also when you think that the structures back in Ghana, for instance, where Adis is talking about, because of the communal system there, it doesn't open itself to a child to be abused. Because if somebody starts smacking a child and it starts getting out of hand, all the other mothers and fathers are on that person. They stop it immediately. So everybody is looking out for everybody. So the question of abuse doesn't happen, because they're looking out for it. That's enough, you stop it right there. Whilst here in England, because people are in a nuclear family home, they're on their own. When they start going overboard with the smacking, there's no adult around to say, hey, hold it right there, stop it. And then it goes overboard and it becomes something else because there are certain frustrations that already exist. So you have all these things. And as you said rightly, when people come over here, it's about helping them to understand that the structures that they were operating in back there are no longer here. The smacking over there was always controlled by the number of people around you who could just really manage it and make sure that you are within reason. It doesn't exist here. So if you start, you might end up in a place that is most unpalatable, and therefore it's better not to go down that route. This is a better route to use here in this country. And I think these are the kinds of things that we need to start looking at, helping people, as you rightly said, Judith, to understand that the system is different. And also what Adis said, the fact that it's no longer the family who become the authority that you are answering to. It's now a local, a structured legal authority that you're answering to. And therefore, it's a completely different ballgame. Yeah. And they need to understand that. And there are lots of differences in the expectations, which is also another expectation that they need to be made aware of. Unfortunately, when they become aware of some of those expectations, some of them find it quite daunting.
I'll give you just one example about the culture. When I was in Ghana as a young man, or as a small boy, anybody came to visit my parents, I may be sitting with my father in the sitting room, maybe talk. The minute he gets a visitor, he disappears. Children don't listen to adults talk. They immediately, nobody has to tell me, they disappear. But you can't imagine that happening in this country. We all sit down, we talk, yeah? There are those differences. Some of them are sort of nuanced, but some of them just happen. That somebody has come to see your parents, so you are really outside playing. When they are ready to go, they come and say, young boy, where? Really, that's... So in terms of the culture, in terms of the norms that we have, it is very important to actually do a lot more advocacy, to do a lot more positive parent of children, so that most of us understand that the way we were brought up, we are within a different system, and there are different ways in which we can do, which may be equally effective because the children are in a different setting, and the children also maybe have different expectations of their parents because they hear from their friends that this is what parents do with them. So maybe people see it as probably being a little bit more permissive. I'm saying that there are different norms of cultural behavior which people have to learn in this country. So we look at it in this country that these are positive ways of probably bringing up a child within the context of maybe the West advanced world. Okay. So you can't bring the notions of how you were brought up to say that that is how you are going to bring up your children here. And so when there are conflict, and indeed there have been a lot of conflict between parents having brought up in a particular way in Ghana or in Africa, who have come here, who want to do the same things.
Yeah.
And they can't do those things because we live within a different system, and this system probably value responsibilities towards children more than we value it in our country because we live within a welfare system in this place. Government authorities also have a duty of care towards the children. And that's where all the stuff gets tossed up, and that's where all the problems come up. And indeed, what I've also seen is that where children are concerned, when a child reports something, wherever it is that is heard, I think the social workers, and by rights, have to take a very aggressive approach because you are dealing with vulnerable people, if you see what I mean.
I do, but I think that the learning is on both sides. The people who come from abroad come with their customs and their ideas, which obviously sometimes are not compatible with what's happening here. But by the same token, you also need social workers here. We're now living in a multicultural society, and they really would do well to try to have an understanding of how other cultures work so that they do not unnecessarily punish families. By punishing families, you're punishing the children in particular by taking draconian measures. And I'll give an example. An example is back home, because the kids live in this communal situation there. An auntie will be cooking and there's a child who likes cooking. So she sits with the auntie. Before you know what, by the age of 5 or 6 or 7, they can actually cook themselves. So the auntie would allow her to do the cooking. She'd be sitting by the child, would come and cook the rice and do the whole thing. Before you know what, that child is cooking. So we know that children can learn to cook very early, and they are actually actively taught to cook early and do household chores at a very early stage because it's part of training the child and bringing the child up, so that everybody in that huge household has got a responsibility. Somebody's sweeping in the morning, somebody's doing something else, and they have a time when they all do their various duties before they go off and play. So everybody has a responsibility. When they come to England and you start fostering that kind of responsibility onto the children, it's termed as abuse. So when social workers go in and they find a little girl standing on a stool trying to cook rice on the cooker, you know that is abuse, because then there's going to be draconian measures taken against the parents because the child is being abused, and and all the various labels that go with that. And again, I come back to the fact that it's about the system. This is a system which encourages young kids to become independent and learn how to do all these things at a very, very early age.
Yeah, I think it's important to have a better balance, right? To go off of what you're saying, Auntie, is that in the UK and in North America, we can also receive a lot of lessons and a lot of better practices that can be embedded, right? And almost sort of blended together in a much, much better way. For example, now in North America, we've seen a massive increase in kinship adoptions, right? So that concept clearly has come from Ghana and other countries around the world, that they have been doing this, as we said, since the beginning of time, essentially. Within the Western world, where we have families that are living more separate, right? Whether it's individual houses in the same town or even moving far away from one another, it does create such a different just system in itself, right? You don't have the family support in the same way that we used to. Although in some respects, we're coming back to a little bit more when you look at something like the housing crisis that's also happening. We actually are starting to see more multi-gen family structures, right? So sort of returning to, again, a practice that's been done by many cultures forever.
The economy is dictating at this time.
Exactly. Yes. So it's really fascinating, isn't it? To see these practices work very well. We can buy a 7, 8 bedroom house and live together, and everybody has their duties, like you shared, and has their responsibilities. But I think it's a fine line between, the abuse one is very tricky, right? There's a duty, as you rightly said, Mr. Ade, about children, ensuring children's safety, right? But doing so in different contexts, in different ways. So again, is a child who's 5 able to stand at a stove and cook? If they're being monitored and supported, sure, right? They're being taught safety around use of the stove, oven, etc. If a child is left, right, we know that yes, accidents can happen. So there has to be that, again, that middle ground, and looking at situations, I think, from slightly different lenses would make a world of difference.
It's interesting. I recently saw a video about schools in China where children, 5-year-old kids in nursery, are actually cooking. They're doing woodwork. And of course, they're not standing on chairs to cook on the stove because the stoves and everything are at their level. And they're cooking whole meals and everything. And so this is a structured system. Whilst in our homes, it's informal, they actually have a nursery that has a structured system of teaching them all these things that adults are doing. And you look at a child who cooks an entire menu and the child is only 5. It's actually fascinating to see. And when I saw that, I thought, I'm familiar with that because I know that. But they made it more formal than ours, which is informal and within the household. And it's fascinating, actually. And it works. And I think if it's done properly, it can work.
Yes, yes. Well, this has been so informative. I think the key for me, my takeaways are, as a social worker who's gone into households, who's had to assess folks and families, and I'm thankful that I knew about some of these cultural practices and the differences. And also I took opportunities to really support and educate families. So again, I think it comes back to that piece around education, around openness and awareness, right, from all parties, to be able to really see the advantages that occur in other cultures that the West may not be as commonplace with, and vice versa. Because again, as we're saying, corporal punishment does not now is after all the studies and things have been done to acknowledge that corporal punishment is not really a successful form of redirecting a child, right? We're finding so many better parent opportunities and ways to parent. And if we are able and open to blending those cultural, I think we'll be having such as you said, children will grow up in such a more, ready for the world in a different way than you maybe see some children going in some places now, right? But again, going back to what we had in the past, there are many elements to that we can bring forward to ensure that children are being cared for and loved and nurtured. And it just might look a little different than what we're used to. So we really thank you so much for sharing with us today and expanding our knowledge and our audiences.
Yeah. And I think also, in addition to what Judith is saying, also to encourage more African, heritage people, tell them that, look, it's not much different from what we had before. So please come forward, adopt the children, because you know what? All it takes, it's simply a little bit of a paradigm shift in the way in which we think, and recognize that because of this structure, whatever we're using back at home has to change, and therefore opening our understanding to what the changes that are necessary are for us to become effective parenting here, to do effective parenting here. And that's all it takes. So for us to be open-minded and to welcome some of the good ideas that come. And yes, the idea of blending the two will be ideal. And if we can do so effectively, that's the William formula, basically. The kinship care also, something for more families to come forward to help out with their own children, the people within their families. So Ade, thank you so much for coming to share with us the cultural experiences that you have been through, especially how you grew up. And I think that's, especially you're talking about the 50s, that's very significant. That's good.
There weren't that many estate homes for nuclear families. All the homes were huge. But within that system, I mean, if I would just sort of wrap up with what I was started saying, that within that system, there are also informal adoption methods that take place. So, for instance, there are certain women who don't have children of their own, but who see that there's a responsibility for them, customary adopt children within their family setting and look after them. And indeed, when they actually pass on some of the wealth that they've made to those children. All that is accepted because that formal process of witness within family systems and that process of actually sealing everything with a drink is being done. So many ladies that I know actually adopted people from their own family in a customary way. And it's worked for a lot of them.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Adi. It's been a lot of interesting sharing. And I really hope that it's opened people's understanding also to the fact that there are different ways to make things work. I was going to say to kill a cat, but no, we're saying different ways to make it work, parenting work for children and still be safe and nurturing. And I'd like to encourage more people to come forward to adopt and to foster. So Adi, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us and this custom. I think it's opened our understanding. Judith and I are going to go back and do some more talking about it, but we'd like you to come back and to share some more of it with us. Yeah.
Anytime you want me, I'll sort of try and come and probably try and explain what I know, because like I've always said, I can really only talk about what I've known, what I've seen, what I lived with. Okay, so thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you very much, Baff. To all adopted people around the world, I dedicate the song Desiderata by Les Crane.
And remember what peace.
It's a powerful, life-changing poem for hard times, which inspires hope for all who hear it. My message to all adoptees is summed up in the chorus. You are a child of the universe. No less than the trees and stars, you have a right to be here. And whether or not it's clear to you, no doubt, the universe is unfolding as it should, and you have a unique and very important part to play in it. So stay strong, positive and focused, and you will thrive. I want to thank you all for joining us at Adoption Dialogue. If you have any questions or comments, send it to us at adoptiondialogue@gmail.com or drop it in the comments section of our social media platforms with the handle Adoption Dialogue without the UE at the end of dialogue. Thank you again. Stay tuned for our next episode on social media. Bye for now and stay blessed.